Hoje é mais de meia-noite o rolê. Meia-noite e 10. Mas bora terminar. Fazer aqueles lunge feio e tentar me pendurar na barba. E não aguentar me pendurar na barba e não conseguir fazer o abdominal porque eu não aguento ficar pendurado na barba. Stonks. Esses são os planos de hoje. Eu vou fazer na intensidade 2. Não vou esperar 3 minutos entre o pé e o abdominal, não. Vou fazer os dois coisas e depois eu espero. Uma esperada só para os dois.
Keir Starmer's had a tough year and a bit as Prime Minister. His approval ratings have cratered, borrowing costs have surged, and the most recent poll we could find put Labour in joint third, on a par with the Tories, 16 points behind Reform and a point behind the Greens. Nonetheless, there's long been a sense that, for all his shortcomings, Starmer isn't going anywhere. After all, he's still got a stonking majority in the Commons, and he's just the fourth Labour leader in British political history to actually win an election. Unfortunately for Starmer, that's apparently changed, and Labour MPs have been telling Westminster journos that the situation has become terminal. So, in this video, we thought we'd try to explain how they've come to this conclusion, and why Starmer's eventual ousting looks increasingly inevitable. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So, before we get into it, a quick caveat. In this video, we're not saying that Starmer's downfall is imminent. Rather, we're saying that there are now a number of structural factors that are constantly dragging Starmer down, making it near impossible for him to recover. There are at least three structural factors. The first is what we might call his budget dilemma. The second is that he's now so unpopular that he can't recover, and the third is that he lacks a long-term project to convince Labour MPs and voters to stick with him. Let's start with a budget dilemma. In short, Starmer boxed himself in at the last general election by doing two things. First, promising not to raise any major taxes, and second, setting himself some relatively strict fiscal rules, limiting how much he can borrow. Importantly, these borrowing limits are based on forecasts by the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, which happen every 6 months. This might have worked if the UK economy had suddenly boomed, but while the UK is faring better than some of its peers, the global economy as a whole has slowed, largely thanks to Trump's unorthodox trade policies, taking the UK with it. In practice, this has meant that every 6 months, when the OBR releases a new forecast showing that things haven't got better, to adhere to its own fiscal rules, the government currently has to either tinker with some minor taxes to raise revenue or cut spending. This is clearly unsustainable. Businesses don't like the government constantly fiddling with taxes, and neither voters nor Labour MPs like spending cuts. This has left Starmer with a budget dilemma. He can either continue to stumble on and desperately hope that the UK economy suddenly booms, which feels unlikely, or, at the next budget, he can break one of the two promises he made during the campaign. In other words, either raise one of the major taxes, like income tax,
Nem dá pra sentir no
or do away
abdômen
with this fiscal
e a
rule.
mão fica morrendo de se
Of these
pendurar.
two options, raising taxes looks
15 segundos.
feasible, largely because the bond markets don't really want to lend the UK much more money anyway. At least
Quatro já?
not
Tá
very
porra.
high interest rates. At the moment, it seems that Starmer is planning to bite the bullet and raise taxes. But while this might be the lesser of two evils, it's still pretty terrible for Starmer. Breaking manifesto commitments isn't always the end of the world, but it's a bad look when A, it's a commitment that everyone knows about and that you reiterated hundreds of times, and B, you don't have a good excuse for breaking it. Starmer and Reeves are currently trying to blame Brexit, but this doesn't really fly, because everybody already knew about the negative economic consequences of Brexit back when Starmer made those promises. This will also make Starmer's removal even more tempting for Labour MPs, because Starmer can take the fall for the tax rises, and a new leader can reap the political rewards of that newfound fiscal space. The second structural issue facing Starmer is his unpopularity. As a politician, being a bit unpopular isn't the end of the world. You can just do popular things to turn the tide. Starmer's allies in Parliament, for instance, like to point to Margaret Thatcher's first term. Like Starmer, her first year was a bit of a disaster and her approval ratings slumped. But then she started doing popular things, her approval ratings improved, and she went on to win 2 more elections. The problem with this analogy, though, is that Thatcher was only quite unpopular. Even at her lowest moments in her first and second terms, her approval ratings never really dropped below 30%, and her net approval rating rarely fell below -35. Starmer is way less popular. Most pollsters currently put his approval rating below 20%, and his net approval rating somewhere between -40 and -50. And these numbers will probably fall further after the tax rises at the budget. A recent Ipsos poll put his approval rating at just 13%, with a net rating of -66, the lowest satisfaction rating recorded by the pollster for any Prime Minister going back to 1977. When you're this unpopular, even when you do popular things, instead of those things making you more popular, their newfound association with you makes the things themselves less popular. We're already seeing this with Starmer. Digital ID, for instance, was actually a pretty popular policy before Starmer endorsed it, at which point the public turned on it. A poll in June found that 53% of voters were in favour of digital ID cards for all Britons, with just 19% against. Polling after Starmer's endorsement, however, found that the percentage in favour had fallen to 31%, with 45% now against. So, you get the idea. There comes a point where you're so unpopular that there's no way out. Anyway, the third structural problem for Starmer is that he doesn't have a long-term vision or project to convince not just voters, but also Labour MPs that all this pain is worth it. This is something that lots of Westminster journos are talking about. Apparently, when they talk to Labour MPs, their main problem is that they don't understand what this is all for. If there was some grand project in mind, some light at the end of the tunnel, they might be more willing to accept Starmer doing unpopular things like raising taxes. But the lack of project or vision means that they just don't think it's worth it. Like the other 2 problems, this doesn't seem fixable. Starmer has proved singularly incapable of articulating any grand vision for Britain, and at this point, he's tried so many resets and come up with so many missions, milestones and foundations that voters have just stopped listening. You get the idea. While Starmer's downfall probably isn't imminent, although Labour's appalling result at the Caerphilly by-election last month has apparently sparked some chatter about the prospect of a post-budget leadership challenge, things aren't going well, and perhaps more significantly, now look unlikely to get better, making it increasingly hard to see Starmer surviving next year's local elections. We discuss those elections in the next edition of our magazine Too Long, where we have whole articles about what each party needs to do in the local elections, looking at polling since the election and going through a checklist of what both Starmer and Farage need to achieve in the coming months. The next issue of our magazine Too Long is all about that, with our headline section titled The New Middle East. In it, we run through each country in the region and discuss their future, before reflecting on how recent events have reshaped the Middle East forever. We obviously talk about the Middle East a lot in videos, but this is our most zoomed out, detailed and thought through coverage yet, truly outlining how we see this region re-emerging. It's not just that though, there's also been a whole lot of major elections this year. So in this issue we have a whole section talking about all of the major elections that have taken place this year, and how global politics has changed. There's also articles on everything from China's continued dominance.
Bad news for me. I'm now about to talk about one of my favourite childhood franchises. Take a look at this. Of the 4,500 recent reviews for Total War Warhammer 3, only 22 are CG positive. So it's safe to say it's been a bad month for Creative Assembly. It's more of a unique than a review.
Creative Assembly, solta o ápice que eu quero falar de ele.
Players did it. It's safe to say it's gone far beyond that. So the last few weeks are being treated as essentially a referendum on everything that's been wrong with Creative Assembly or Total War, and a big opportunity for players to punish them for said failures. And so far, unlike the last few times, there is no sign that players have any intention of reverting these reviews. People seem real angry, and for Creative Assembly, it's a worst possible timing, and that's because they staked everything on the pulling off a massive 25th anniversary celebration that would reveal what's next for the franchise. But with their current game in fire, that's not looking like a safe bet. Total War is no stranger to review bombs, so we're not quite in Shadows of Change territory here. It's not that bad. It is pretty bad though, and if you're not aware, Shadows of Change was a DLC that was basically just shrinkflation.
Nice.
There was less content and it costed more. People were rightly pissed. Now, the old
Pode tatuar, tô ligando não. Quero saber de eixo.
There's a crisis in the cosmos, and the fate of the entire universe depends on it.
Yesterday, the IDE of choice among Vibe engineers and the king of VS Code forks, Cursor, released version 2.0, and it contains new features that will terrify all of the AI coding doubters, haters, and non-believers out there. This video is not sponsored by Cursor, but over the past year, their meteoric rise is impossible not to notice in the programming space. They went from zero to a $9.9 billion company in a matter of months by simply forking Microsoft's VS Code and duct taping ChatGPT to it. But there's a reason Cursor is so popular. It targets the happy, productive middle ground for programmers who know how to code, but who simultaneously hate writing code. And Cursor 2.0 pushes this idea even further with 5 new features you need to know about. It is October 30th, 2025, and you're watching the Code Report. Like most people, I use AI coding tools like Cursor as a friendly assistant, asking it to generate some boilerplate code here and just applications there. But recently, I met a 12-year-old kid at a birthday party who's making 50K MRR on his side hustle, and he told me I was doing it wrong. He said, you need to think like a Roman slave driver, where the hand worked to the stone.
De galinha picante?
Anywhere in life, you need to
Pegou ou pegou o
coding
azul?
agents in parallel, all
Peguei o de galinha
pushing
picante, de galinha
fixing
picante era
code
bom,
on the master branch simultaneously,
ladrão,
not the
pegou
wolf
azul.
main branch. I
Ué,
asked
só
him
de
how he
carne,
does
pô.
it, and he said, quote, the cursor is the digital
galinha?
lash I wield to drive these agents ever forward. I couldn't believe what I was hearing from this kid, but then I realized I just made this entire story up in my head. But Cursor has never really been a true AI company. It does have great tab completion AI, but like most startups, it's mostly just a nice UI wrapper on top of foundation models like GPT-5 and Claude. Well, not anymore. They now have a new model called Composer that allegedly approaches the intelligence of the best frontier models while achieving higher speeds, much higher speeds. And that's huge because waiting for slow-ass GPT-5 and Claude to get work done is a huge bottleneck. But I have my doubts about these Trust Me Bro benchmarks. These are internal closed source benchmarks that don't even compare Claude, GPT-5, or Gemini directly. And Composer also doesn't show up on any external benchmarks like LM Arena or SWE Bench yet. That's SAF, and the only thing we can do is try it out ourselves, like I'm doing here in the new Agent View mode in Cursor 2, which is a UI update that cleans things up when you're doing chat-heavy development. But the craziest feature you need to know about is its Git worktrees integration. A Git worktree is basically just a local copy of your code that won't conflict with your main Git workspace. But what that enables is working with multiple agents simultaneously on the same task. Like here, I'm building a design system for a web app. My client wants a button in that ugly neo-brutalism design, so let's go ahead and implement it with Claude GPT-5 and Cursor's new Composer model in parallel. As you can see here, they all get to work, and as promised, the Cursor model model is by far the fastest, with
Tá
Claude
gravando,
second and GPT-5 lagging way behind. But what matters more than speed is quality. When we compare them side by side, they all have a reasonable level of quality, but I think Claude and GPT-5 are still a bit better looking than Composer. But let's go ahead and try another UI test by having them generate some buttons in Apple's new Liquid Ass design. This time, when we compare quality, there's a big difference. The Claude definitely puts forth the most effort with these nice animations, while the result from GPT-5 was embarrassingly bad. However, Cursor Composer did a surprisingly good job. At the very least, it seems like the Composer model has some potential. But another awesome feature is the new native browser, and this is an actual productivity game changer for me because I constantly find the AI doing sloppy work on complex UI features. Now with the built-in browser, I can easily pinpoint the exact HTML element that sucks and add it directly to the chat. And we also get full Chrome DevTools support here to easily add that stuff to the chat as well. When it comes to Cursor, the only limit to your potential is not your imagination, it's how much money is in your bank account. But you shouldn't just slop out every new feature from scratch, and that's why you need to know about PostHog, the sponsor of today's video. It's an all-in-one suite of dev tools that's like a Swiss Army knife for building better products. It gives you product analytics, session replays, feature flags, and...
Welcome to the month of music, 30 days, 30 breakdowns, and 30 chances for you to learn about your favorite music. Today we are talking about perhaps the creepiest, weirdest theme from maybe any Pokemon game ever. It's from the original Red and
Lavender
Blue,
Town.
Red and Green in Japan, and fair warning, it's really bizarre and it might hurt your ears, and it's part of the reason it has a very weird lore behind it, but let's just listen to it first. Ah! Oof. Then it starts over and goes on and on and on ad nauseum. So this is Lavender Town. If you're familiar with the game, this is supposedly a haunted level. It's where you find the ghost Pokemon, and it's very evident that the intention was to make this a creepy theme, and boy did they succeed at that. Because when we look at what's going on here musically, you're kind of left going, well, hang on. Not only am I thoroughly disturbed, but I also don't really have any clue what's happening. As was sort of required by the early Game Boy hardware, this entire piece is essentially just like 4 parts, and we can see them all written out here. We have a sort of, would you call this an ostinato? I'm not really sure what the proper terminology for this is, but this consistent theme that goes on through the entire thing. It switches up octaves from here and there, but for the most part we're playing 4 notes, and it is C, G, B. Not really a whole lot of harmonic information in there, is there? But it is weird. Now, one thing I think is really interesting about this, as we're going to see as we break this down, is the harmonic information except for a couple of small parts. For all intents and purposes, it's indicating something that could and should be beautiful, but it's not. So what's actually happening here? Well, we have that theme that comes in. Now, those notes together, definitely, yes, that's absolutely a dissonant sound. It's not necessarily a pleasant sound, but still, there's not really anything here that tells us much about what's going on harmonically. But then the melody comes in. Okay, a lot of interesting things going on there, but I want you to take notice of that first part where the melody comes in. We have 2 notes, G and E. Every piece of harmonic information here is telling us that we are playing get this, a major 7 sharp 11 chord. We have a C, we have G, we have B, we have E, and we have F sharp. Now, when we play a C major 7 sharp 11 chord, most of the time, it's a beautiful sound, right? It's an absolutely gorgeous sound. So why does this sound so unsettling and so bizarre? The way this marches on has some really interesting qualities to it. I mean, the first thing we hear is a perfect fifth, but then these two notes are interesting to me because we have an F sharp. Now, its relationship to C, of course, is a tritone, and that is inherently dissonant. It's inherently a little bit unsettling. But what's interesting to me about this is we have essentially 1 5. Then, if we look at B and F sharp, that creates a 1 5 relationship as well, but it's a half step down. Here's another way to look at those 4 notes. Look at that. If we look at those 4 notes in this way, well, now they have a little bit of a different characteristic to them. Now we have a half step relationship, which is about as dissonant as you could possibly get, and we have a half step relationship, which is about as dissonant as you could possibly get, and they're separated by a tritone. There's a tritone in there. That's really interesting. So it just goes to show you that even though the notes themselves, theoretically, should sound beautiful, they don't, because of the way they're related to each other and the way they're used in sort of marching context. Okay, that's first and foremost the thing that stuck out to me. But then we move on and we get all the while that
Consegui me segurar até de boa, não foi? Fiz 20 km nesse último aqui. Só que eu não tô soltando, seguramento, eu tô sentindo um negócio aqui assim, ó. Tem uma veia que tá estourando ali, mas tem os tendão aqui, ó. Quando eu paro de segurar, eu sinto uma dor aqui nesses 2 tendão aqui descendo no braço. Mas eu tô segurando mais porque tá evoluindo algo, né? Então, por hoje foi isso aqui.